22nd, 2015. Okay, we'll begin with the homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning, everybody. Okay, so we are continuing with the discussion of Sutta number 137 in the Majjhima Nikaya. This is called the āyatanavibhanga Sutta. This is the analysis of the Sixfold Base, or the six sense bases. And as I pointed out last time, the Sixfold Base, or the six sense bases, is really just like the starting point for the discourse. But as the Buddha develops the discourse, he moves into other topics, which are all sort of evolving out from the six sense bases, but leading to like higher and higher stages of realization or attainment. So last time we went over the six internal sense bases, which are the six sense faculties: the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. The six external sense bases, their corresponding objects, the six classes of consciousness, and the six classes of contact, the contact of the mind or consciousness with the object through a sense faculty. Then the 18 kinds of mental exploration, and the 36, what are called the 36 positions of beings. Did I do this? Did I complete the 36 positions of beings? Okay. I know that now I see that I did paragraph 13 also. I think I didn't do paragraph 14. And so we'll resume at paragraph 14. So the 36, what are called the 36 positions of beings, just to recapitulate, and you find them sort of laid out schematically on the handout, that we have six kinds of joy based on the household life, and this is briefly summed up as the joy at gaining forms, the six sense objects: forms, sounds, odors, tastes, tactile objects, mental objects. Then six kinds of joy based on renunciation. This is the joy that arises along with insight into the impermanence of the six kinds of sense objects. Then there are six kinds of sadness based on the household life. That is sadness at not gaining the objects of desire, not gaining forms and so on, And then 6 kinds of sadness based on renunciation. And that is a little bit, initially it's a little bit perplexing, but basically it is when one has insight into the impermanence of the sense objects, but one is not able to reach any kind of higher attainment, then one has this sadness or displeasure at the thought, when shall I enter and dwell in that base that the noble ones enter and dwell in? And so one has a longing for what is called the supreme liberations, and then grief or sadness arises based on that longing. Okay, so then this applies to forms, sounds, odors, and so on. So we get 6 kinds of sadness based on renunciation. Okay, then we come to the new section. This is 6 kinds of equanimity based on the household life. And as I explained last week, this distinction of household life and renunciation is sort of not necessarily tied down to those who are householders and those who are monastics, but it's rather the attitude or the orientation that is the key distinction. Whether one is being oriented towards grasping and clinging, in which case it's called something that pertains or based on the household life, and if one is inclined towards relinquishment, giving up attachment, then it is based on renunciation. Okay, so now we come to the 6 kinds of equanimity based on the household life. And the word for equanimity here is upekkha. Usually we think of upekkha in Buddhism as being always a positive virtue. But here a distinction is made between upekkha as a positive virtue and also upekkha as, call it a fault, a defect, a liability. So the 6 kinds of equanimity based on the household life would be upekkha as a defect or a liability. So this is the case. First we'll take the actual text of the sutta. On seeing a form with the eye, equanimity arises in a foolish, infatuated, ordinary person. The word rendered here, ordinary person, this is putujana, which is also rendered a worldling or a common person. And this is also described as the untaught, uninstructed worldly person who has not conquered his limitations or conquered the results of his karma. I have to say it's a rather peculiar phrase, and who is blind to the danger. So I would describe this as what we might call dull indifference, the kind of neutrality of the attitude of maybe apathy or complacency, of not caring one way or another. And so it's said that such equanimity as this does not transcend the form. That is why it is called equanimity based on the household life. Yeah, the commentary explains this as the equanimity of unknowing, of lack of knowledge. And if you know, if you're familiar with the Abhidhamma teaching of different states of consciousness, different chittas, this would probably be the equanimity which is present in some of the akusala chittas, the unwholesome states of consciousness. Particularly it's the equanimity that's present in 4 of the unwholesome chittas rooted in greed, in the chitta connected with doubt, in the chitta connected with restlessness. Correct? Okay, so the simplest way to understand this is, I use the phrase dull indifference, worldly apathy, or as the commentary explains it, the equanimity which is based on unknowing or ignorance. Okay, then we have the 6 kinds of equanimity based on renunciation. Then these are explained as the types of equanimity that arise as a result of insight knowledge. So when one knows the impermanence, change, cessation of forms, one sees as it actually is with proper wisdom that forms both in the past and now are impermanent, bound up with dukkha, with suffering, and subject to change. So in that case, equanimity arises, and such it's said that this equanimity transcends the form. That is, it rises above attachment to the form. Whereas the equanimity that's connected with the worldly equanimity doesn't transcend the form, in that it can still be tied up or bound to attachment to the form. Okay, then the same applies when knowing the impermanence of sounds, odors, tastes, tactile objects, mental objects. Basically the same elaboration. Okay, so that takes us through the 36, what are called the 36 Sattapada positions, translated here, positions of beings or states of beings. Maybe states of beings is better. Okay, any questions at this point on the 36?
The equanimity based on the household life, that's not really equanimity, is it? It's more indifference than...
Well, I would prefer the word indifference, actually, but in Pali it turns out to be the same word, upekkha.
Okay.
When we render this in English, I mean, to be consistent, we render it as equanimity. But when we think of it as a negative or unwholesome quality, sort of equanimity doesn't quite ring a bell. So we can call it indifference, dull apathy. Okay, I don't see any other hands, so we'll continue. Okay, so the exposition of the 36 positions of beings sort of lays the foundation for what is going to come next. And this is the teaching which is directed towards what I would call the process of transcendence, of overcoming what is inferior or lesser in order to arrive at what is superior, at a successively higher state. And as we'll see, that the Buddha has laid this out in a kind of schematic way, almost as though one is climbing a ladder, going from lower steps on the ladder to successively higher steps on the ladder. Okay, and so the process of transcendence is summarized in a little statement or a little formula, which is, by depending on this, abandon that. And so even this brief statement of the process of transcendence shows that there are 2 factors involved. One is, you call this the aim of the process of transcendence, and that is to abandon what is lesser or inferior. But if we just say, abandon this, then one is left without a method. And so then the Buddha gives the method with the other phrase, which here comes first, depending on this. So by relying on something which is superior, then one is able to abandon what is inferior. Again, to use the simile of a ladder, let us say it's a really long ladder, sort of leaning against the building. Then when one is climbing the ladder, one doesn't simply use your feet to go from one rung of the ladder to the next rung of the ladder, but one holds with one's hands, one holds on to either the rails of the ladder or to the higher rungs so that one is secure and doesn't stumble and fall off the ladder. And so one depends on the higher things, in this case, in order to abandon, to give up the lower things. Okay, so let's see how the Buddha lays this out. So he says, here, by depending and relying on the 6 kinds of joy based on renunciation, abandon and overcome the 6 kinds of joy based on the household life. It is thus that they are abandoned. It is thus that they are, here Nyanamoli used surmounted, but maybe I would prefer transcended or overcome. Okay, by depending and relying on the 6 kinds of grief or displeasure or sadness based on renunciation, abandon and overcome the 6 kinds of sadness based on the household life. It is thus they are abandoned, thus they are overcome. By depending and relying on the 6 kinds of equanimity based on renunciation, abandon and overcome the 6 kinds of equanimity based on the household life. It is thus they are abandoned, thus they are overcome. Okay, so this is laid out, you could see, in a pattern of pairing 6 kinds of joy with 6 kinds of joy, 6 kinds of sadness with 6 kinds of sadness, 6 kinds of equanimity with 6 kinds of equanimity. And what is probably of these the most difficult to overcome? Which do you think is the most difficult to overcome? Maybe I make it a test. Excuse me? Equanimity? Anybody else have any opinion about that? What is it that craving really yearns for and attaches itself to? Is it equanimity? Yeah, joy, pleasure, delight. Excuse me? Yeah. I mean, there's a subtle kind of equanimity or indifference, which can generate its own kind of attachment. But the most obvious base of attachment is joy.
I have to say from my life's work that it would depend on what kind of person you were.
Maybe so.
A really depressed person, you'd be clinging to sadness, and overcoming that, you would transcend.
I'm not so sure. I mean, I think that there is a certain personal variation, but I think depressed people would like to be happy, which is why they would go to see psychologists or psychotherapist in order to move from sadness to some kind of happiness. That's my opinion. Okay, so how does one renounce the joy based on the household life? The sutta doesn't actually explain in a methodical way how one does that, but the Buddha does give various methods in other suttas of developing, we call this the mind of renunciation, the mind that's ready to give up the joy or pleasure based on the household life. We get sort of a concise expression of this in what is called the progressive discourse of the Buddha. For example, I think we find this in Sutta number 56. Yeah, this is page 485. Okay, when the Buddha is giving a progressive instruction to the householder Upali, he explains the danger, degradation, or you could say the vanity and defilement in sensual pleasures and the blessing of renunciation. Okay, so one way to give, or at least one approach to giving up the joy based on the household life is to see into, we might call this the danger, the āyatanavibhanga, the drawback, and the defilement of sensual pleasures or pleasures based on the worldly life. And what is the danger or drawback in pleasures based on the worldly life? At least from one angle.
Joy does not last forever.
Okay, in one word, summarize. It's impermanent, yeah. Also, it's in some way, at some level, bound up with dukkha, with unsatisfactoriness, displeasure, suffering. And we could see fuller expositions of the drawback and sensual pleasures. You look at Sutta number 13 in the Majjhima Nikaya. Sutta number 75 actually is the most powerful. This is like on page 611, where the Buddha compares the joys or pleasures of sensual indulgence to that of a man with a skin disease. Here it's given as leprosy, but maybe it's some other disease. But he gets his pleasure from scratching his wounds. And when he's scratching the wounds, he thinks, this is pleasant, it's really enjoyable. But when he gets cured of his illness, then he realizes that having that skin disease was really painful and miserable from the start, and that the pleasure that he got from scratching the wounds was just a very low and vile kind of pleasure. And so if they give him a choice, would you like to have that skin disease again in order to get the pleasure from scratching your wounds? He's saying, no, I would be much more satisfied to be cured of the illness. Okay, and then comes sort of a counterpoint to the joy of the household life is the joy of renunciation. So this would be the freedom that, initially at least, the freedom that comes from being tied and bound up to sensual enjoyment. And then as one proceeds further, particularly with bhavana with meditation, there would come the joy of overcoming the 5 mental hindrances, the joy and pleasure of the jhanic attainments, and then what's mentioned in this sutta, the joy of insight, of gaining insight into the impermanence of all objects of the senses. And so using the framework of, or the method of this sutta, by depending on the joy that comes from insight into impermanence, one gives up the joy that comes from indulgence in the pleasures of the sense objects. Okay, the next, this is a little more difficult. By depending and relying on the 6 kinds of, let's say, sadness or displeasure based on renunciation, abandon and overcome the 6 kinds of sadness based on the household life. I'm trying to think whether people actually use this approach, or whether it's just included here for the sake of consistency with the method of exposition. Can anybody think of particular cases where one might use the sadness based on renunciation to overcome the sadness based on the household life? It seems to me more likely that to overcome the sadness or displeasure based on the household life, one would move into sort of seeking the joy based on renunciation. And so one would get a certain joy that comes from insight into the impermanence of the 6 sense objects. But then, when one fails to proceed further and to reach what the text calls the supreme liberations that the noble ones enter on, then that sadness would arise, or that displeasure. Yes, Christopher. Please take the microphone.
I think sometimes if you have some kind of personal, like, existential crisis,
Yeah.
you can have some hint of the knowledge, things are,
You
can have some hint of the knowledge that everything is impermanent, the universe is so vast, what am I?
Yeah.
And that's kind of a grief based on renunciation, I feel like, which leads you away from worldly distractions, watching TV and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's a possibility. Anybody else have any? Yeah, take the microphone.
In the previous paragraphs, when it said about the monks seeing, when shall I enter upon and abide in that? When you see how hard it is to get to those states, you see how our joy in the worldly life leads us further away, and that kind of creates more grief, I think, in that by depending on relying on 6 kinds of grief, you're seeing that you don't see that as joy anymore, you see that as grief. And that grief, I think, is contributing to more grief because you're seeing how it's leading you away from where you want to go. When we're trying to walk the path, I start to see how the worldly life leads you further away.
Yeah.
It's not joy anymore. You're seeing it as I see it as grief, because what starts out as joy always ends in pain.
So you're seeing that the joy of the worldly life is really bound up with suffering and leads to more suffering.
Exactly.
Yeah. But that's the point that I made earlier in regard to giving up the 6 kinds of joy based on the worldly life through seeing on the one hand, the impermanence or the unsatisfactory nature of those joys. But this is using the sadness or abandoning the sadness based on the worldly life. Let's see. Based on 6 kinds of sadness, based on renunciation, one gives up the 6 kinds of sadness based on the worldly life. In most instances, I find that a little difficult to see. Yes, please. Please take the microphone that will be handed back.
I'm not sure if this is directly related, but sometimes when I'm focused on suffering of a worldly nature, sort of an oh, woe is me nature, I can think about beings that are struggling simply to live.
You think
how
about
much the beings that are just struggling to live and how much suffering we experience collectively, and think about how far we are from liberation, and that's sort of a transfer of my own worldly sadness to a sadness that's maybe of the renunciate category because it's looking at suffering collectively.
Okay, possible. Okay, let's go on anyway. So now we come to by depending and relying on the 6 kinds of equanimity based on renunciation, abandon and overcome the 6 kinds of equanimity based on the household life. Okay, again. I don't know, I don't want to seem like a little too rebellious. But again, it seems to me that sort of the more direct way is to overcome, call this the 6 kinds of worldly apathy or indifference. It seems to me that one normally moves from that worldly apathy or indifference to the joy of renunciation. And maybe then from that joy of renunciation, then one cools that off to get to the equanimity based on renunciation. But that is sort of anticipating what's coming in the next section. Can we think of cases of proceeding directly from the equanimity based on the household life to the equanimity based on renunciation? Maybe somebody with very sharp insight who starts off as, let's say a worldly person immersed in this dull apathy and indifference. Then he learns about the Dharma, starts practicing insight meditation. But normally, even in the sequence of insight meditation, one goes through stages of exhilarating joy and piti and sukha before it sort of cools off and gets to equanimity. But maybe because he's making that equanimity his aim, so he remains fairly indifferent to the joy and rapture that arise, and then moves into the equanimity based on renunciation. Take the microphone.
Thank you. I would think that once you've experienced joy based on the worldly life, you become jaded after a while and indifferent to things. And it no longer stimulates you.
Yeah.
And then just you have as much of access to all these worldly stimulations as you could wish for, and yet they then pale because what do you go from there?
Yeah.
Kind of thing. So you become indifferent to it all.
Actually, that's a good idea. That here, well, in this case, one is not so much going from equanimity based on the household life to equanimity based on renunciation, but one is going from the joys based on the household life, the pleasures, well, maybe through understanding their impermanence, their unsatisfactoriness, then one becomes indifferent to them with a healthy kind of indifference, and then one moves into the insight that leads to equanimity.
The Buddha mentions that the renunciant is supported by insight. It's not just somebody who's new to it, it's somebody who's insightful and looking at equanimity.
Yeah, well, I said that this is the insight based on, or equanimity based on insight.
Right.
In any case, it seems that the scheme that we have laid out in this paragraph here about depending on this, abandon that, it's a little bit of an oversimplification, I would say, for the ease of exposition, but actually there are all sorts of more complex routes that people can take depending upon their past experience, their dispositions, and just their way of evaluating and treating their experience. Okay, but now with the next paragraph, and here in the sheet that I handed out, I have this laid out in section on the process of transcendence, section B. I call this the refinement of feelings based on renunciation. And so now we're taking just the feelings or the experiences that arise on the side of renunciation or the side of spiritual cultivation and moving from what are considered the grosser states to the more elevated states. Okay, and so here, by depending on the 6 kinds of joy based on renunciation, abandon and overcome the 6 kinds of grief, sadness, displeasure based on renunciation. It is thus they are abandoned, it is thus they overcome. Okay, so we take the case of a person who is gaining insight into the impermanence, change, and fading away of forms and the other objects. Then this longing for the supreme liberation arises, and then because of that longing, displeasure arises, conditioned by that longing. Okay, so now to overcome that displeasure, one relies on the 6 kinds of joy based on renunciation. So suppose the person hasn't yet reached those states of supreme liberation, but still, okay, I'm just putting myself in that position. This longing is arising, one is feeling sad, maybe discouraged, despondent. And so there are ways to reflect that will help one to overcome that discouragement, that sense of despondency, and to generate joy based on renunciation. So like one of the methods that the texts will recommend, that the texts do recommend, is recollection of the Buddha. This is a meditation subject that naturally generates joy and happiness. So when one is feeling despondent and discouraged, then one can reflect on the Buddha, the qualities of the Buddha. And so one takes, the way I would explain it is, the text enumerate 9 qualities of the Buddha. But to make it simple, I take 3 qualities. Arahang, the worthy one or the holy one, Sama Sambuddho, the perfectly enlightened one, and Bhagava, translated the blessed one, but the Bhagava is really the fortunate one, the one who possesses all excellent qualities. And so when one turns the mind towards the recollection of the Buddha, then there arises a feeling of joy, bliss, delight, even ecstasy. Similarly, one can do the recollection of the Dhamma, qualities of the Dhamma, that one has gained access to this well-expounded Dhamma, which is directly visible, inviting investigation, and so on. And recollection of the Sangha. One could call to mind a community of, say, the enlightened monks and nuns, and recollect their qualities, their noble qualities, and then rejoice in that. And so, instead of being discouraged and despondent, in this way, one can bring up joy and happiness. Another meditation object that brings up joy and happiness are the Brahmaviharas, especially loving kindness, or altruistic joy, mudita. Keep away from karuna, compassion, because then you have to focus on the suffering of others. And if one is feeling inwardly miserable or depressed or dejected oneself, then if one focuses on the suffering of others, it can pull one down. But by either extending loving kindness, the wish for the well-being and happiness of others, or by rejoicing in the good qualities of others, then it will uplift the mind. And then when the mind is uplifted, then one could turn to insight into the impermanence